Humanitarian interpreting. Humanitarian interpreting happens in situations of conflict. And in situations of conflict, we usually see humanitarian action. If you look at the statistics, over 65 million people have been forcibly displaced. Of those, more than 21 million are refugees. The context is characterized by a large diversity in languages and cultures, and I am listing here but a few. Communication is therefore absolutely essential. Quality communication is essential. Looking at the context in which this kind of quality communication is needed, you can see different refugee camps, different refugee settings, low resource environments, very, very little resource enabled environments that we can draw on. The reality of armed conflict is real every day. We require safe access to deliver any kind of training. The context is also characterized by a large number of women and children seeking assistance. It is highly unlikely that those women and children are competent in foreign languages that allow them to interact with international NGOs, with the humanitarian system as a whole. So what does InZone do? What is the change that we want to see? We're actually working towards inclusive and equitable quality higher education for sustainable development. We encounter a large number of problems, such as fragility, conflict, low resource environments, diversity in languages and cultures. The solutions that we implement are focused on transformative pedagogy, adaptive technology, and 21st century skills. And the outcomes we witness are indigenous knowledge production, design solutions, empowered learners, and learners who develop life and livelihood skills. The impact that we ultimately seek to see is building back better for sustainable communities. The framework within which we work is human rights law, humanitarian law, and refugee law. The humanitarian principles, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, do no or less harm, accountability, participation, and respect for culture and custom, these principles characterize our work and our work environment. But how can we hear the voices of disaster and conflict-affected populations? Here are but a few comments. Oh, the interpreter was also my driver and my security guard. You know, I never thought about interpreting. Or we just used the closest person with language skills, or I understand a little bit of Swahili. You have no idea how many times the interpreter mistranslated messages. Clearly, this level of quality is not sufficient. We do need quality humanitarian interpreting. Humanitarian interpreting is the activity performed by interpreters when working for organizations with a humanitarian mandate. And there are a few examples here, like the Red Cross movement or other international NGOs who work in the humanitarian space. Humanitarian interpreting is characterized by fragility of the operational environments, interpreting in situations of human suffering. The beneficiaries of the services are usually persons of concern to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and there is a complete absence of occupational structure. We pioneer innovative approaches to higher education and multilingual communication in communities affected by conflict and crisis. And you can see some of the refugee camps and other fragile contexts that we work in on this slide. So what makes humanitarian interpreting so difficult? Languages and cultures, the diversity, ethics, the role of the interpreter, power relations, the role definition, rapid decision-making, and emotionally charged discourse. We base our training on scientific understanding of how people acquire difficult skills. For that, we look at opportunities, we look at the motivation and promote that motivation and strengthen it, and we look at how our learners can acquire competency and skill and proficiency despite the odds. One of the real challenges is ethics. It's intimately tied to the role of the humanitarian interpreter. And if you look at some of the key concepts of an interpreter's code of ethics, these are neutrality, impartiality, confidentiality, integrity, respect, and fidelity and accuracy. Let me walk you through a couple of ethics cases that are tough, and they're all taken from our work with our learners. The example of an interpreter working for a humanitarian organization who was assigned to work with a certain officer in the field. And after working together for a while, the interpreter learned that the officer takes bribes from some of his clients in exchange for their entitled humanitarian service. This was really shocking to the interpreter, and she wanted to talk to the officer to remind him that the beneficiaries are entitled to receive the services free of charge and that taking bribes was unacceptable. However, the interpreter did not dare to do so, as the officer was her boss. What is the dilemma? The interpreter experiences a serious dilemma. The interpreter reports to the officer as her supervisor, and this job is her only livelihood. The officer is a powerful officer in the organization. So what kinds of strategies can we develop? In that case, the interpreter needs to approach higher managerial officials in the organization and inform them about the conduct of the officer and what he is doing in the field, which is tantamount to corruption. Should the interpreter fear for her safety, she needs to discuss with the officials on possible mechanisms that could facilitate an investigation without her identity being disclosed. To conclude, by doing this, the interpreter has taken a hard and ethical decision to recommit herself to the principles of humanity and the do no harm. Since she's associated as humanitarian interpreter with this officer acting inappropriately, the interpreter should not allow any behaviors that contravene humanitarian standards and victimize beneficiaries. Let's take a second case. In the aftermath of the war, you're assigned as an interpreter for a humanitarian organization that is helping people to resettle. You are the only interpreter in the area, and among people that you are serving comes the person who persecuted you during the war. What is the dilemma? The interpreter is emotionally disturbed, but needs his job. The client is also emotionally disturbed, but needs help. The humanitarian worker does not know what is going on, and the interpreter needs to take a quick decision. What are the strategies? The humanitarian principle of impartiality needs to be applied, whereby the interpreter is not supposed to take part in any kind of hostility. Our interpreter here is expected not to use his position to get revenge on the person who persecuted him. As an ethical decision, the interpreter can choose to overcome his emotions and interpret for the person in need, or decide to let the humanitarian worker know his situation and get another interpreter for that specific client. As you can see, there are many challenges in training, but one of the ways that we have overcome many of the challenges is through the development of our transformative pedagogy and our collaborative learning ecosystem, composed of the students who are at the center, the lecturer or teacher, online tutors who are subject matter experts, online facilitators, and the course coordinator. All of them work in tandem in a digital learning ecosystem. We use virtual and blended learning. We use learning by doing. And we've built learning hubs in different refugee camps and other centers in order to allow access to online learning to our learners. Sometimes learning has to be carried out in situations of considerable risk. WhatsApp is one of the applications that we use extensively to stay in touch 24 hours a day with our learners. We're here whenever they need us, and they know that this particular opportunity provides them with a chance to really access learning 24 hours a day. However, we've also initiated some very innovative connectivity options, such as connecting different refugee camps. In Kakuma, we've built the largest capacity in humanitarian interpreting. So when we started working in the Middle East and needed Arabic English, we drew on the competencies and the capacities that we had built in Kakuma refugee camp in the Horn of Africa. And via WhatsApp, our competent interpreters in Kakuma are tutoring our learners and beginning interpreters in Azraq camp. We've developed learning pathways for all of our programs. Here, for example, our course package in human rights and children's rights and global health, going into a bachelor's degree with Kenyatta University, or our health courses that we deliver together with the medical faculty at the University of Geneva, learning pathways with local universities in Somalia, or in humanitarian interpreting, where we start with non-credit-bearing courses, move up to credit-bearing certificate-level courses, again with partner universities, and all the way to graduate degrees at the University of Geneva. We have a variety of advanced graduate degrees on education emergencies and higher education emergencies, and then digital learning in those environments, and we partner with large humanitarian organizations in order to design, develop, and deliver those courses. All of our learning is really clearly referenced with the European qualification framework so that it's transportable and globally accredited and recognized in terms of academic credit for courses that students are following. We also have developed online learning materials. Many of our donors are asking us now to develop common goods that are accessible by anyone, anywhere, to enable anytime, anywhere learning. Our rapid response module for humanitarian interpreters is but one example. This will be followed by another one coming out in 2019 that takes humanitarian interpreting to a slightly higher level of skill proficiency. Here are just some screenshots from our online learning materials. All of what we do really is subject to scientific validation, and in addition, of course, because we're also largely donor funded in the field with monitoring and evaluation procedures. This is one way for us and an important way for universities to create scientific evidence and to ensure that the impact that we make and the models that we develop can also be employed by others. Conflicts arise because human communication fails. We feel that education needs to listen to and work with the people at the receiving end of humanitarian aid. So thank you very much for your assistance, and I know that Ahmed will continue with his account of his experience as a trained humanitarian interpreter, and I'm very much looking forward to listening to him as well. Thank you very much.